almost heaven. West Virginia, Blue Ridge Mountains.
Hi, Grammars.
What are you doing here?
Hi, I'm Rob Bilott. Really appreciate the opportunity to be able to talk to you today on the occasion of Earth Day and join with the voices of all of those across the planet who are doing everything we can to help protect our environment. You know, for me, I've spent the last 20 years trying to spread awareness about a family of chemicals many of you are probably only now hearing about, called per- and polyfluoroalkylated substances, or PFAS. You know, these are a completely man-made group of chemicals, didn't even exist on the planet prior to World War II, that have now managed to find their way out into our environment, where they are now being found in drinking water all over the planet, in soils all over the planet, in living things all over the planet. And this is something that happened during most of our lifetimes. This is something that had contamination that's occurred over the last 70 years. Yet most of us have only just now begun to become aware of what's been happening. And we may wonder, how did that happen? How can something like this occur during modern times and none of us really become aware of it until only relatively recently? And unfortunately, this is a story that involved concerted efforts to cover up and conceal information about these chemicals for many, many years. And only through the dedication and determination of individuals like Mr. Wilbur Tennant out near Parkersburg, West Virginia, whose cows were dying, who came to me one day almost over 20 years ago saying he wanted to find out what was killing his cows. He was convinced there was something that was in the white foaming water his cows were drinking that were making them sick.
What if whatever's killing those cows is in the drinking water?
And it was through his determination that we all ended up finding out that there was, in fact, a problem there. There was a chemical, one in particular called PFOA, part of this growing family of chemicals we now know as PFAS, that were not only in the water that Mr. Tennant's cattle were drinking, but we soon found out was in the drinking water all over the United States. And now we know it's in drinking water all over the planet. And what we learned was, after we finally started digging in to documents that the companies who had manufactured and released these chemicals for decades had withheld from the scientific community, from the regulators, from the public. Once we started looking into those documents, we saw that these were chemicals that had been brought out onto the market after World War II, before there were a lot of regulations. And even though the scientific community, the regulators, the public didn't know anything about them, the companies manufacturing them knew a lot about them. They knew that they were incredibly toxic. They had this ability to persist in the environment. Once the chemicals got out into the air, into the water, into our soils, they didn't break down under natural conditions. You may now be hearing these referred to as forever chemicals, because once they get out into the environment, their unique man-made chemical bond makes it almost impossible for them to break down. So what's been emitted out there over the last 70 years is still in our soils, in our water. And more disturbingly, what the companies understood is not only did these chemicals get out and stay in our environment once they were released, they had this uncanny ability to get into living things, into animals, into people. And what would happen is these chemicals would get into the bodies of living things, stay there, persist for long periods of time, and build up over time. So they were not only toxic, but persistent and bioaccumulative. These chemicals were used in such a vast array of different products over the last 70 years, not only stain-resistant carpeting, non-stick cookware, fast food wrappers and packaging, firefighting foams. Because of their widespread use, they managed to find their way out into our environment over the last 70 years and into all of us.
You knew, still you did nothing. You want to flush your career down the toilet for some cowhand?
You want to take everything that you know and turn it against an iconic American company, like an informant. Isn't that right? Isn't that right? Isn't that right?
Yes.
These chemicals are found in polar bears now, in Arctic ice. And the only reason we found out any of this was one individual who had the guts to stand up and say, I think there's a problem here. I think there's a real problem being caused by these chemicals that are coming out of this landfill, getting into my cattle. And through his determination, that led to all of us now understanding what these chemicals are and the scope and magnitude of what we are now facing, which is global contamination of man-made chemicals in our environment, in living things, on an unprecedented scale. And I'm really excited to be able to see that Mr. Tennant's story and the story of how this information was withheld, how it was eventually brought out to the public. That story is finally making its way out into the world so that scientists, regulators, those of us who've been exposed can now understand how this happened, how we can stop things like this from happening going forward. There's now a movie documenting Mr. Tennant's story and the story of his community, Dark Waters.
He was willing to risk his job, his family, for a stranger who needed his help.
Mark Ruffalo, participant media, Todd Haynes, there was a tremendous group of people that got together to make sure this story was brought out to the entire public. I've also done a book called Exposure, documenting the story so that everyone can see the history and understand the facts of what happened here. There's a documentary as well featuring the real people so that everybody can see this is an environmental problem that affects all of us. It's something each one of us can do something about. Hopefully, if folks are able to see the films, the documentary, the feature film, the book, that people will understand and be inspired to know every one of us can stand up, speak out, and make a difference.